The second Starship launch in a row explodes before completing ascent. Now we're wondering how this affects the prospects for SpaceX Artemis demos next year. Does this delay them farther? Propellant transfer was already delayed, so even if Artemis is decimated by the budget axe, will Starship's private plans for Mars be pushed beyond 2026? In the meantime, NASA continues to get Artemis II hardware ready at Kennedy Space Center, and we got some new details on how they're going to try to roll out for launch by the end of this year.
Hey everybody, thanks for your time. That's what we'll be talking about this week, plus some news about Mobile Launcher 2 and the Gateway Lunar Link.
Starship Flight Test number 8 lifted off in the late afternoon of Thursday, March 6th from Starbase in South Texas. Liftoff occurred on the second attempt after the first was scrubbed on Monday, March 3rd. The big picture outcome of the test was unfortunately the same as with Flight Test 7. This was the second flight of the first major revision of the ship design, and it once again failed to complete orbit insertion and exploded, meaning that once again the ship failed during launch rather than after completing the test, ending only 8 minutes into an over hour-long planned mission. There was an explosion in the engine compartment at about 8 minutes 5 seconds after liftoff, which quickly stopped the operation of 4 of the 6 Raptor engines. That immediately produced asymmetric thrust and loss of control, and the test ended with what again looked like the whole ship exploding farther downrange. Observers in Florida from the Cape Canaveral Kennedy Space Center area to Miami and in the Bahamas captured views of the ship being destroyed at altitude and raining of debris, and once again many of these were posted on social media. This time the disintegration of the ship and falling debris caused ground stops at airports in central and southern Florida, Orlando, Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. Prior to the explosion in the engine compartment, there did seem to be anomalies in the video from the engine area, but we'll have to wait for more detail from SpaceX on what happened. The Super Heavy booster stage was again successfully recovered, but this second flight test setback in a row will further delay the overall development schedule, pushing back execution of the test objectives that weren't performed on test number 7. Unless SpaceX decides to combine objectives from multiple flight tests down the road, now Flight Test 9 would cover the objectives that could not be performed on Test 7 and Test 8. It also would push back an orbital attempt to no earlier than Flight Test 10, again unless there's a change in plans. Although this is the second test in a row where the ship was destroyed during launch rather than post-splashdown after executing all its intended test objectives, there's still no indication that this changes the future of Starship. It probably changes the timeline, but that's still a question of when, not if. From an Artemis standpoint, Elon Musk had recently suggested that delays had already pushed the on-orbit propellant transfer demonstrations into next year, 2026, and the outcome of this test could further delay Starship development milestones, including the technology demonstrations that directly affect the Artemis III schedule. Since the Artemis brand name was coined in 2019, delays to Artemis III have always been a function of delays to all the programs involved, including Starship. But now there's even more uncertainty about the Starship schedule than at the beginning of the year when President Trump took office again, bringing Musk to the White House. Before they took over power, Musk promised that Starships would launch to Mars in the next transfer window at the end of 2026, which is approaching 18 months away. Eric Berger reported for Ars Technica on Friday, March 7th, that Trump and Musk plan to cut the NASA Science Directorate budget in half, which was part of the rumors of all the terminations and cutting they were planning for NASA. But even if Trump and Musk are still going to terminate some or all of Artemis and pivot from the moon directly to Mars, that on-orbit cryogenic fuel management and transfer technology will still be critical for Starship to go to Mars, and this setback threatens to further delay readiness of that technology past that next Mars transfer window. Musk called the second straight launch failure a minor setback, and that the next Starship would be ready to fly in 4 to 6 weeks, which would be as early as the beginning of April. We'll be watching for that next month, as always. There's more to report on Artemis II this week, as there are more visible signs of activity on the elements of the vehicle during this phase of launch preparations. In the past week, the Orion spacecraft was moved by prime contractor Lockheed Martin out of the Final Assembly Systems Test, or FAST cell, in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at Kennedy Space Center to a work stand to complete assembly of the service module. This week, the 4 solar array wings were attached to the European service module, and the word was that installation of the launch fairings, also called Spacecraft Adapter Jettison Panels, or SAJ panels, would begin this weekend. At the beginning of the week, the Orion program published a set of images of the spacecraft as solar array wing installations started. At the end of the week, NASA published a couple of images of the spacecraft after all 4 solar array wings were in place. The solar array wings were the last in-space hardware to attach, and the SAJ panels encapsulate the service module for launch. Once those installations are complete, Orion will be moved back to the FAST cell for final crew module installations, in particular the forward bay cover, but also those motor adapter truss assembly feet that were noted in the interview I recently did with Exploration Ground Systems. The MATA feet are a part of the launch abort system that will be installed in the ONC building this time to help optimize the overall launch processing workflow. EGS spacecraft offline operations will take over the spacecraft after Lockheed completes final assembly and test, and move it to the multi-payload processing facility for fueling and other commodity loading. Then they will stack the launch abort system on the Orion crew module and encapsulate the crew module in the launch abort system facility. I interviewed Artemis II Mission Manager Matt Ramsey during the week, and he noted that the SLS in-space second stage, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS, was expected to be moved to the MPPF any time now. That was one of the takeaways from the interview, which was that he provided a near-term status update on the Artemis II hardware.
And I'm assuming that you're aware of where we are with the hardware at KSC, but boosters are stacked. Yeah. We'll start core stage stacking on the 20th, so a couple 3 weeks out, and then we'll stack LVSA, ICPS, and do a bunch of integrated test and check out of the rocket systems, and then we'll pull in Orion late summer, early fall, mate Orion, and do Orion checkouts through the end of the year to get ready for flight for next year.
Yeah, I was actually I'd heard that they were getting ready to move ICPS this week across the causeway, so we're looking for that hopefully either by the end of the week. So no, I appreciate it.
I think they're shooting for Friday, so
okay.
Keep your eyes open.
It's worth repeating that the core stage mate operations will take place over multiple days, since the stage will be rotated twice in order to move from its vertical orientation in High Bay 2 of the VAB to the same in High Bay 3. The large High Bay integration cells in the VAB are divided by the transfer aisle, and there are separate heavy cranes that move elements around vertically, one between High Bays 1 and 2 and the other between High Bays 3 and 4. As with a few space shuttle orbiters that needed to be transferred from one stack to another, the core stage will be rotated from vertical in High Bay 2 back to horizontal on its ground transportation carrier on the transfer aisle floor. That's one crane operation. After the cranes are disconnected, the carrier will then be picked up and rolled under the heavy crane for High Bays 3 and 4 for the next crane operation. The core stage will then be picked up again off the carrier with 2 cranes, rotated to vertical and hanging off the heavy crane, and then lifted up and over into High Bay 3, and then lowered down in between the boosters. Mr. Ramsey will serve the role that Mike Serafin did for Artemis I, and actually the plan is for them to trade off, with Mr. Serafin being the mission manager and head of the mission management team again for Artemis III, and then Mr. Ramsey for Artemis IV. But right now Artemis II is number 1 on the runway, so to speak, and I asked him about a few new developments in planning for the launch and the mission. I'll go through the interview in detail in a standalone video, but here's a summary of the main takeaways. First is about the work to date for launch readiness. Collectively, the NASA team involved has done all the work, and that date is to be announced. As NASA has noted a few times more recently, April 2026 is being called a no later than date, but Mr. Ramsey also referred to it as a commitment date, which is something official that NASA does for Congress. The work to date is before that, and he talked about something that Amit Kshatriya said before Christmas at a KSC media event.
I don't want to get out in front of anybody on announcing that, but it is before April, and we're working still to pull that back even further to the left. We were challenged to roll out by the end of the calendar year, and I think we're pretty close to that. So,
the second development was that the approach to rolling out the vehicle for a tanking test and for launch changed. The plan now is to combine that into a single rollout and pad flow. It would follow a similar outline as what we saw for the early commercial crew launches to the International Space Station, with 2 tests followed by the first launch attempt. So the vehicle would be configured for launch in the VAB and rolled out once. The plan is first to do a dry dress rehearsal, for this called a Countdown Demonstration Test or CDDT, where the launch team and the flight crew goes through a day of launch rehearsal countdown without fueling the SLS vehicle's 2 liquid propellant stages. Then an uncrewed wet dress rehearsal would be conducted, which is one type of tanking test. If the WDR is planned like the one for Artemis I, the vehicle would be fueled on the same countdown timeline as a launch, and the countdown would run down through the 10-minute long terminal sequence up until a few seconds before ignition. After that test, the vehicle would be detanked and recycled for a launch attempt a couple of days later. If they aren't able to launch within the first launch period, then the launch team could work with the Eastern Test Range on an extension for the flight termination system operational life, and/or could leverage the contingency pad access system that is being developed in order to stay at the pad and avoid rolling back to the VAB. I interviewed Mr. Ramsey on Wednesday, March 5th, so this was before the Starship Flight Test 8 mishap, but I asked him about the possibility of some kind of demonstration on Artemis II with Starship. Given the large amount of firsts planned for Artemis III, that had been something that NASA began looking at last year after Artemis II was delayed. The Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel has said that they think Artemis III is oversubscribed with firsts, and that the aggregated risk to that may be too high. So the Moon to Mars Program Office, headed by Mr. Kshatriya, was looking at possibilities for making Artemis II more robust. Mr. Ramsey said they were looking at trajectory, range, and communications demonstrations, but concentrating more on the last 2 due to the Artemis II mission profile, which flies a series of 3 increasingly eccentric Earth orbits, the last one which flies by the Moon. He did say, though, that any joint Orion Starship demos on Artemis II would depend on hardware availability, and that could be more difficult now with the setbacks on the last 2 Starship flight tests. On March 1st, the second umbilical tower module for Mobile Launcher 2 was lifted and mated at the Launch Complex 39 East Park site. Module 5 is the second of 7 umbilical tower subassemblies that are being partially outfitted offline in the KSC industrial area by prime contractor Bechtel, and then hauled out to the ML's construction site for stacking with the rest of the umbilical tower. At the East Park site, Bechtel is working on outfitting the launch platform base of the ML, in addition to interconnecting the 2 stacked tower modules as much as possible at this stage of construction. In other news and notes, on Tuesday, March 4th, the European Space Agency posted an image on social media about the Gateway Lunar Link element, which will fly on the Habitation and Logistics Outpost module. The flight hardware is beginning integrated testing. Previously called the Halo Lunar Communication System, part of the Gateway European System providing refueling, infrastructure, and telecommunication, or ESPRI, the picture supplied with the post not only shows the flight hardware, but also includes a poster showing where it will be attached to the exterior of the Halo module. NASA also posted some old imagery taken in December of SLS stages production at Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. These are milestones that were already reported, or ones that have been followed by subsequent milestones. One set of imagery showed the core stage 3 liquid oxygen tank when it was moved into the primer spray cell right before Christmas on December 23rd. Another set of imagery goes back to before Thanksgiving and early December, showing one of the core stage 4 forward skirt L-rings and the barrel being loaded into the vertical assembly center welding tool. The imagery, particularly of the L-ring being loaded into the VAC, is really interesting and is good reference material, but this work was completed a long time ago and won't be relevant until the next periodic review video, presuming the situation for SLS hasn't changed in the meantime. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative, and consider subscribing if you want to find out more about Artemis every week.